So, welcome everybody. I've got a fantastic guest here today on the ERG podcast, Maceo Owens, aka ERG Homegirl. Maceo, how you doing?
I'm doing good, doing good. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to join us. Really excited to learn from you about your experiences within ERGs and kind of some of the things that you think people should really start to pay attention to. So again, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, there's a lot on this. So yeah, excited to talk about it.
So I think it's only right if we start with the story. Like, how did you get into leading ERGs? Like where did that start? And what made you so passionate about it? Because we were talking offline, and I know this is your thing. You are all things ERGs. You said, like, how did you get to that point?
Yeah, I will give the semi-abbreviated version because it can get pretty lengthy. But I'll say it really started at my last company that I was at. I was actually a support agent at the time. A lot of people don't know, but I've only been within the ERG space for 2 years. Granted, since I've been in it, I'm all the way in it, and I
Wow.
that's all I think about. But in general, it's only been about 2 years. So actually, towards the end of 2019, um, I was trying to get a promotion, just trying to be like supervisor, in my current role, and I was denied for it because basically I was told that I was not social enough, which I was like, is that a reason to deny someone? Like they're like, you don't talk to anyone, you're just in your own world. And I was like, what? And
Wow. How,
beyond the fact that
how'd
go
that
for
make you
it.
feel? How'd that make you feel?
I was very, very upset to the
Yeah.
point where I was actually about to quit. Um, I mean, and it became a thing where it wasn't about performance anymore, and it felt like an excuse. And I feel like a lot of people from backgrounds like myself, like that's kind of what we're met with a lot of the time when we reach out for more. And it felt like normal stuff. And like, this is, I guess, what it is. This is what happens when I'm in a support role. Keep in mind, didn't go to college, like literally entry level. So, yeah, I just thought that's what it was. And I happened to stumble across ERGs. I didn't know all that time
Right.
that the company even had ERGs. There was a black ERG, and I was like, there's other black people here? Who knew? Maybe I would be more social if I knew that. So just a lot of feelings came up immediately once I found out like there are like black employee communities and this is like a normal thing. Like I had never heard of it. And honestly, even to this day, a lot of my friends, they never heard, like they don't even know that ERGs exist within their company.
Yeah.
So yeah, really that's one of the things that still drives me to this day is the fact that people, even if they've heard of ERGs, they don't really know what they are or what they can do for people. Um, so yeah, I jumped in immediately, became a co-chair of the Black ERG. Um, and then COVID happened,
Yeah.
and then Black Lives Matter movement happened. So that's definitely a fun time to be a Black ERG lead. Um, Lots of responsibility coming out of that, and just the experience that I got, the networking with the executives, meeting other people. Eventually, it became a natural fit that I moved into that company's people team, helping to lead the ERGs there.
Wow. So it was a journey based on the fact that I suppose the opposite was to be said about you. You were not social enough, but then you flipped that and became the most social person inside of the organization, leading that charge and saying, yo, I'm social. I'm going to show you how I'm social and I care. It's funny because I had a similar experience a while back. I was leading a company as CEO, and I remember talking to
Mm,
one of my colleagues, and this was me leading it. And maybe it was just the way that I interacted with people or got on, and they felt like, yeah, like you're not you're not really one that builds culture. I remember them saying that to me,
hmm
and I was like,
Yeah.
wow. None of my friends would say that to me. Like none of my sisters would say that to me. None, like I'm the first there, I'm the one that wants to be. And I think that there's this thing, like you mentioned, like being able to firstly interact with other people, because I was at the top of that organization, so that like it could say it's down to me, so I needed to change that. But when
Mm.
you're kind of in an entry level, as you mentioned, and you're growing, and they use that thing of like the culture,
Hmm.
like
Even
yeah,
when it doesn't exist.
right, what is the culture, how do we define that? So yeah, and it also sounds to me like visibility is key, right? Knowing that these ERGs exist and knowing that you can stay visible and you can start to continue. So that's yeah, really, really interesting. And I was
Yeah.
just thinking about the purpose behind these ERGs. So you mentioned, now this has come up quite a lot with people, that there are multiple ERGs for different topics, different purposes, and different reasons. What do you believe is the core purpose of an ERG? Why should it exist?
I think it's the core purpose, I would say, would be to help employees from these underrepresented backgrounds feel like they have a place in the company and like they matter at its core. I
Yeah,
think I will say, like, I do think that now there has to be some sort of business involvement with ERGs. They have to be more than just community. But that being said, it can still work hand in hand if done right. But at its core, people who are from these like marginalized backgrounds, they feel like this is not a place where I can be myself.
yeah.
And therefore it even shows up where I can't do my best work, or I'm not being like judged appropriately when it comes to performance reviews. Like all these things come out of it. So at its core, I think that that's what ERG solve.
So really driving that inclusivity and making sure people feel like they belong as part of the organization. Like you said, being themselves. Like one of my favorite sayings is be yourself because everybody else is taken.
Mm,
And
I love that.
yeah, I think too many times like we've probably had to be in environments where we've like you hear about like code switching or like trying to figure out how
Hmm.
to and it's tiring, right? It's really tiring and it
Exhausting.
takes its toll over a long, and it's not like tiring immediately, it's over a long period of time. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, let's maybe dive into a little bit more around the specifics of like how do you make people feel like they belong? So you're all in on this ERG movement and notion. I noticed just from looking at your LinkedIn, you're managing a couple of ERGs for really like well-known companies. I saw that Kayak was on there, Open Table was on there, and you had some experience before. As I was looking at DoorDash, you were doing some work there. Firstly, like how do you are you managing multiple ERGs? Are you managing one ERG? And then like how do you structure those ERGs?
Mm, that is a fun question. Well, I will say I manage one ERG program,
Yep.
5 ERGs. Ability is one, Hue for people of color, Pride, women, and veterans, Valor.
Is
So
that
those are
for
the
what
five communities.
is that for one company, Maceo, or is that for multiple companies?
For one, well, Open Table and Kayak are sister companies, so it's one
Yeah.
ERG program that spans across them both. So
Yeah, I thought so actually. Open Table is actually one of my favorite companies. I've been using that
wonderful.
for years.
Love to hear that.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So you've got the oversight on 5 ERGs across these two companies, but as you
Hmm.
mentioned, they have different purposes. So tell me a little bit more about like,
Each of them, yeah.
yeah, I'd love to learn a little bit more about each of them and what you're trying to do within the ERGs and how you support them to be successful.
Yeah, I think as a basic, one thing, not just at Open Table and Kayak, but just in general, that I'm seeing with companies that they need is just a restructure, going back to that word. Oftentimes, ERGs either they existed before 2020 and they didn't really have an impact like that, likely. Maybe they had some events here and there, but for the most part, companies were fine with letting ERG leaders like free roam and just handle things accordingly.
Yep.
Like I said before, I think that with the movements that have happened in the past couple of years with remote work, like there has to be more organization behind ERGs. It cannot just be ERG leaders like in a free for all anymore. So a lot of my work is establishing that structure. So I start typically with like really clear mission, vision, values, training. Like
Yeah.
that is like the basics of it. Clear roles for ERG leaders, because oftentimes, yeah, like the ERG will have maybe 3, sometimes up to 10 people involved in their ERG, but no one has clear roles. Therefore, it's harder to get things done. So that's another issue that I see happen a lot. So that was something that needed addressing. Then the ERGs need a way to promote themselves, to get new members. They need a strategy that they're working towards. So all these things are like part of what I do on the daily, and
So,
like setting that foundation.
so that mission, as you mentioned, and the vision really drives the purpose and the day-to-day of it, right? Like, so you have an understanding of like, what do you come to this ERG for? What are you expecting to get from it? As far as
Mhm.
like logistically, if you look at these ERGs, how many people do you have in each of these ERGs? And then based on the number of people you have, do you have folks that are also like helping you manage that as well? Like, do they have like more of a senior role inside of that ERG? Or is it just you managing them?
So I manage mainly like the high level strategy piece. Each of the ERGs, they have leaders.
Okay, got it.
Typically, yeah, a scaling system that I've been using in my brain, because sometimes I do help like other companies too when they ask for recommendations. I think if you have under 1,000 employees, you can get away with like 3 leaders, but definitely if you have more, I recommend like a 7 leader structure where it's once again clear roles, 2 co-chairs, 2 communications chairs, 2 events chairs, and a finance person, is typically my go-to structure. And then sometimes with companies with like 4,000 or more people, they can look to chapters. I'm not a big fan of ERG chapters, but sometimes there can be a more complex structure there with the leadership, but definitely you need a leadership team for each of them. And ideally people that come from that community. Um, Allies can be of assistance when in, it's not impossible for allies to serve on that leadership team too. I'll say that, but ideally they
Yeah.
come from the community.
And how often are these leaders meeting? How often are they meeting with themselves together to make decisions and really hone in on the strategy?
It ranges, and I think depending on the ERG, they can customize that a little. However, I will say the basic meetings that need to happen, like a minimum cadence for sure.
Yeah.
I think that with their members, so the leaders and their members of their ERGs, I say monthly. I'm not even a fan of quarterly. There
Yeah.
needs to be like a constant point of engagement. Among the leadership team, absolute minimum monthly, but that monthly meeting should be very effective. Like there are ways to host an effective meeting where you're not just talking in circles. Cause I've been part of it a lot of the time where like you just get in this intimate group of people from your community and now it's like, let's like all just talk and get things off our chest, which I think that there's spaces for that that you can create. But within that ERG leadership meeting, you're there to get things done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
having a really clear agenda. And then I would also say I encourage meetings amongst all the leaders in the company, all the ERG leaders. This way they can kind of collaborate, learn some best practices that other people are doing. And lastly, a meeting with their executive sponsor is another one too.
That executive sponsor piece seems like it's key because I've heard a few times from speaking to individuals that are in ERG, so that the employees themselves, that this is nice. We have a place where people have conversations, but it doesn't help me, or I'm not sure on how to navigate inside the organization based on this. Like, I'm not sure like what I get out of it.
Mm,
Because a lot of the time we've seen with ERGs, it has been people that need the help that are being asked to provide the help. And then it's like, I want to get promoted or I want to navigate, like you said, and you've obviously been super proactive about it and decided to flip it on its head. Like, yeah, I'm not social. All right, let's see if I'm not social and kind of go to that mode. But then there are other folks that maybe you've got someone that's working in data science and they're more introverted and they want to
Hmm.
figure out how do they become a senior data scientist. Like, is there paths for that, and can the ERGs help to support that? What have you seen as examples that have been positive, and also maybe some of the negative examples, challenges, that where sponsors have come into an ERG and played some kind of role? Like, what should they be doing and what shouldn't they be doing?
Yeah, I'll automatically, when it comes to sponsors, I automatically think about the executive sponsor at Black at DoorDash, who was like, for me, the model example of an executive sponsor. His name was Ryan, head of engineering, big fan of him. And he was an ally, a white man who was sponsoring the Black at DoorDash ERG. One thing that I left out of my story earlier is that eventually I did end up actually quitting DoorDash after doing all that work. And I was like, it wasn't even about not being compensated as a leader. It was just not being compensated even in my day job, where a lot of this work started to eventually bleed over into. Um, just feeling that underappreciation there. And I just quit. That being said, that same day that I quit, um, the Ryan, he reached out to me via email and was like, we have to find a way to get you back at DoorDash.
Right.
Um, and within a month, I was back on the people team. Now as a salaried employee, double my before earnings. Like, my life changed because my executive sponsor showed up in
Wow.
such an impactful way. So to that point, I mean, that being said, there had to be a relationship built with the executive sponsor. So even with them being willing to take time, at least on a monthly cadence, to meet with the ERG leads to learn what are some pain points that this community is having, what are some pain points that you all are experiencing. Mentorship, I think, is a really powerful way for executive sponsors to show up where there is that one-on-one connection. Uh, and then also just amplifying whatever initiatives the ERG is leading. So if they can promote it to the other executives in the company, if they can promote it to their team and say that ERGs, this is what they have going on, you all should show up. Executive sponsors really serve, in my opinion, as super influencers, like mega
Yeah.
influencers. So whatever they say kind of goes. It gives people permission to do things. So even, but obviously for me, in that case, he gave permission almost to the company to say like, no, she's worth vouching for and worth bringing her back. So there's so many ways that they can show up, but those are some good ones for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That mentorship piece is key. And then as you mentioned, a particular scenario of you being able to move through the organization just by them having that visibility and knowing
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing. And I think that's that's a big part. And sometimes, and I was asking this a little bit earlier, maybe we could dive into it, was like the numbers of people that are in each ERG. How many do you have in each of the ERGs? Because one of the things that I think about is like, you can also get lost. So you're the leader. Okay, that's great for you. And people know you. But what about employee 542? Like, how do they get that visibility, and what should they be doing inside the ERG?
Yeah. So I'll say numbers wise, it can also range per community. In
Yeah,
general, I used to think that the women's ERG always had the highest amount of engagement. And
yeah.
in most cases, I think that that's true in terms of like highest amount of members. Um, so that's something that we do. It's not common, not every company that I'll say. Um, However, my approach to ERG success is first, before even focusing on how many members does each ERG have, I focus on the reach of the ERG program as a whole. Reach specifically meaning of the amount of people that are in the company, how many of them have ever went to any ERG event? How many of them have ever joined any Slack channel? And that's where the data comes in. I'm big on data, big
Okay.
fan of it. But that being said, my goal first is to try to increase that reach to at least 75%. That's my number that I go by. I want 3 out of 4 people in the entire company to have engaged in ERGs in some way, even if it's through a project or something. It doesn't have to be an event, but I need to know that they have had hands-on interaction with ERG, because this way people don't get missed. I was a support employee at a company for 2 years
Yeah.
before I found out that ERGs existed. So now
Wow.
I Can't let that happen anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. And so you mentioned like the data is key for you, and you look at that. What is the main KPI that you think people should be looking at if they're managing an ERG or they're part of an ERG? Like what are the maybe one or two key KPIs?
The program reached the one that I just said for sure. That has to be one. You
Yeah.
have to know. You can't improve. What gets measured gets improved. So therefore, on the vice versa, you can't improve what you don't measure because you don't know where you're at currently. So I most people I know are not currently measuring and seeing what their company reach is. So that's thing number one.
Can we dive a little
Um,
bit deeper into that, Maceo? When you say program
yeah.
reach, just to make sure I'm clear and the audience is clear, what does that actually mean? So you say they interact with maybe an event or they've been part of something. Is that like over an annual basis, every 30 days, every 60? Like, how do you define program reach?
Yes, I'll give the formula
Okay.
actually. In general,
Oh,
I would
wow.
love to say ever.
Yeah, yeah.
But if I were to go back to ever, that means that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of pulling past Zoom reports or like event attendance reports. There's a lot of that historical work. So I'll say start where you can. Either you can start at the beginning of 2022, you
Yep.
can start at the beginning of this quarter or even the second half of the year. Start somewhere. You can even start where you're at now. But these are the three things that I pull for four technically. So thing one, in terms of engagement, what that means, you want to pull your event attendance reports from Zoom. That's thing one.
Yep.
Second, you want to pull your Slack channel members, or if you don't use Slack, if you use Teams, your Teams channel members. If you use neither, just pull a distro list, whatever you're using currently,
Yep.
that tells you who your members are. The third thing is if you have any projects, so projects could range in a number of things. Sometimes I've seen things like, oh, we're sourcing Black-owned businesses. Like if you comment a business in this doc, we'll note your name and we'll like say that you contributed to the ERG in this way. Or maybe it's something small where it's a poll or a survey or a form. You want to get as much information of the forms and things that you put out there and see who has participated in those three things. From there, those are the three touch points of ERGs, either in a project, in an event, or they're in some sort of messaging app.
Yep.
From those three things, you'll be able to see everyone who's touched the ERG program. You want to put that number over the total amount of people in the company. So
Okay.
typically, right now, if companies were to do that, they're likely going to see something between 25 and 40%. Honestly, closer to like 30, low 30s is pretty average for most companies. That is what they want to get up and increase the amount of like people who have ever touched the ERG program.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. It's clear. The reach is key to make sure that you have the visibility. Because if you don't have
Mm-hmm.
the visibility and awareness of what's going on, then there can be no action that can be taken place.
Even then, I was just going to say, even then, the visibility will tell you who's not engaged, which is
Right.
just as important as who is. So then you're able to see by department, oh, like, and 9 times out of 10, you will see the support department with all the hourly employees, and 9 times out of 10, with most of the underrepresented people in your company who are in hourly positions, their engagement will be extremely low. And
Yeah.
that's already an area of opportunity. So, yeah, lots comes out of data.
And how often do you expect people to be engaged in the ERG? Is it daily, weekly, monthly?
I would say monthly is fair.
Okay.
I think monthly is fair, but it's important that that ERG leaders give a way for people to be engaged because sometimes ERG leaders will complain like our engagement is low, but it's like, okay, well, did you host an event
Yeah.
over the past 3 months? No. Okay, are you all posting regularly in Slack, trying to build community? No. So how do you can't be mad people aren't engaging if there's nothing provided for them to engage with.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And then, so if we dive a little bit deeper into the structure of each of the ERGs, So you mentioned Slack a couple times as one way to do it. Maybe people are using Teams, maybe even people are using EQ, right? Because we can talk about that as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, but as far as the structure itself, how do you structure the topics and who comes up with that? Is that down to the leads to say these are the different channels inside of the ERG that people should be having conversations around? And like how are those decisions made?
In my opinion, and it's
Yeah,
a strong opinion,
yeah.
if there
We like
is
strong
some,
opinions.
yeah, that's typically how I operate in.
Yeah.
Especially if there's someone in a position like me where I'm leading the ERG program, I need to be the one who sets those standards for
Okay.
a few reasons. But really, uniformity, I think, is an not underrepresented, underutilized tool. Like
Yeah.
people don't understand the benefit of your ERGs being uniform in their structure. But really, it like people respect a clean looking ERG program. Oftentimes, maybe you're the reason why people aren't engaging because if it's messy, if everyone's using all these different tools and all these different channels, it's going to be that much harder for employees to justify to their manager, like, oh, I want to join an ERG because it's not going to be easy for people to go and learn about your ERG or to participate. So, across the board, I would say make it really clear across the ERGs. Like, this is the process on how you'll engage people. Slack is where you'll build your community. You're going to have a regular event.
Yeah.
You should do some sort of project or initiative on a quarterly basis. So it should be the same across all ERGs.
Got it. So the structure is key, ensuring that you have that uniformity. And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned earlier around the leadership team, and one of the key areas that you mentioned in leadership was finance. So budgets are something that come up quite a lot when we have conversations around ERG and we speak to people. How do you think about really creating the appropriate budget for each ERG? Like, what should you have as an ERG, and how do you determine that? And if you can share some examples, even better, like of kind of general ballpark numbers, because I think people are always like, what should the budget be if I'm doing an event or I have a speaker in, or like how do we manage that?
Yeah, that's a fun topic because I've seen companies with budgets of 50,000 and I've seen companies with budgets of 2,000. I've seen companies with no budget.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it ranges.
yeah.
I would say the unfortunate thing is that ERG leaders don't have control over how much budget they're given. What they do have control over is when they are given budget, how they're using it.
Right.
And that is what's going to help increase your case for a budget. I think like I said, I've seen this huge range, but 9 times out of 10, not always, but often, companies with a larger ERG budget, the ERG leaders just kind of spend it very frivolously, a good amount, maybe like 5 to 10,000 on swag alone, which is like,
Wow.
I mean, it's cool, but the fact that some companies like are really operating off of a $1,000 budget and they can bring more impact to their members off that $1,000 budget than that $10,000, $5,000 in swag shows a lot. So I would say definitely with whatever budget you have, making sure that you're very intentional on how it's spent and the impact that it's bringing to your community and not just throwing money around to throw it. Even some companies, the crazy thing on the other side of the spectrum would be some companies with these smaller budgets don't know how to spend it. It'll be the
Right.
end of the year. They may have only $1,000 for the whole year and they're like, we don't know what to spend it on, which is crazy because it's like it was only 1,000, but it happens. But with
Well,
that, that's why you got to be intentional.
I was just going to jump in there and say, like, so being intentional, if you've got, let's say, 1,000, 10,000, what would be your top 2 or 3 things that you think is worth spending money on in an ERG?
Top 2 or 3. That's a tough one. Here's what I'll say how to determine it.
Right.
Because I won't say the same thing across all ERGs, but here's how to determine it. One thing I always recommend for every ERG is to do either a focus group or a brainstorming session with their members. Like they can do it live in a meeting or they can do it asynchronously in like some sort of brainstorming tool.
Yeah.
But this way, they know from their members, what do you want from this ERG? Because if the ERG leaders just go and decide what should be spent, they could buy something that's totally off from what the people want. And that's the most important thing with ERGs is what do the people want?
Yeah.
So that's the best way to determine it for sure.
Got it. Making that process of budgeting, spending inclusive, right? Which is the nature of the ERG. So almost crowdsourcing that. So when it comes down to it, it's like, hey, like you kind of voted on that or said this is what we were going to do, and you were part of that, and that's what you wanted, and that's why we have this. Okay, that's really insightful.
And that's data that you can provide after. Like it's no longer just saying, oh, we spent this amount of money for the year. Now it's saying X amount of people like rated on a scale of 1 to 5, like it was a 5 in importance that we donate to our community externally. So therefore we developed a strategy on how we're spending this money to donate to our community in very intentional ways. Like that's a whole nother conversation than just showing, oh, we spent 2,000 on an event or 3,000 in audiobook credits or what have you. So it helps them at the end of the year, whenever they do performance reviews, to be able to really articulate their value to the organization too.
Yeah. So we talked about the data kind of leading up to that. So let's measure. We have to be able to measure in order to manage. Then you've got, prior to that, like when you started originally, that purpose, making people feel like they're belonging as part of it. What are the results that people can expect if they are engaged in an ERG? So you've gave a good example for yourself personally, but what are some of the success stories that you've seen of like people who've just been going hard, they believe in it, they're all about it, and they've had success from that, not only from the individual standpoint, but from the company standpoint? What does that bring to a company if you really go for it with your ERG?
Yeah, there's a lot of things from an individual standpoint. I'm not the only person who I've seen who's had a huge career development based on their ERGs. I've seen so many people. I'm so proud of all of them moving from hourly positions to salary positions. And that's new opportunity. And honestly, even the domino effect that has, like even me moving into a new position and learning about equity and things like that, now I can spread that to the people around me and like tell them there's a bigger world than taking lunch breaks out here.
Right.
Which it's sad, but a lot of people who are in these underrepresented communities, they don't know. So that's like, it definitely impacts the broader world. But in terms of the company, there are so many ways to measure ROI there. You can directly link it and measure it to, for instance, your recruiting strategy. Like, is this going to potentially decrease cost per hire? Is it going to are we going to get more referrals through the ERG program if we leverage them? Through marketing, so many ways. Like, sometimes the marketing team can have trouble coming up with content, like let's just say for LinkedIn or even for their social media. Well, now you have a whole community of diverse people. You don't just have to pull from your immediate team, which may not be diverse, but now you have a whole community of people who may have an interest in participating and in helping with the content. And they might be really excited to do a blog post where you might think it's an ask. That might be a bonus for them. So there's so many ways, even just measuring, like from a customer support standpoint, there might be a good amount of customers who are calling in, reporting, giving feedback around D&I related issues. But if you don't track that, if you don't partner with the ERGs to like work to improve things, or even back to recruiting, like is your recruiting process inclusive? There's so many ways that ERGs can contribute to a business. And honestly, we're at a time where businesses need to plug in and to have these diverse efforts more than ever, because 9 times out of 10, they're not doing it in the most inclusive way.
So I have a view on that, a strong opinion on that. Why do they need to do that, in your opinion? What happens if you don't do it?
I mean, things stay the way they are, which I think is, I would say is bad.
Yeah.
But I know, unfortunately, some people are comfortable with the way things are. And that's also what the fight right now with D&I is combating. But just the fact that by doing things that aren't inclusive, now you're leaving out an opportunity to have new ideas, fresh perspectives, like people who, but there's just so many benefits of having diverse people on the team and using your product. I mean, and I
Yeah.
always go back to the business case because 9 times out of 10, that's what executives want to hear. But people might not be purchasing or using whatever your business sells because you're not diverse. And that's
100%
on
agree.
you.
100%
It could
agree.
be that easy just to fix it. So yeah.
So and so I'll go back to like the open table thing. I've been using open table for years and I love open table. Now, it makes me like open table even more that you're the community manager and you're doing a great job and they've got these ERG. That makes me feel good. Now, had I have found that a company like that was doing something that was untoward, I'd be less likely to spend. And I'm starting to notice as time gets on, as you get a bit older and you're a bit more conscious about the dollars you spend in certain areas. You may not check it out initially because you might need that thing right there and then. But then when you reverse back on it, it's like, hang on a minute. Does this company actually care about like people or black people? Like for your second purchase. So I think there's a big business case for that second purchase, as well as it just creating high performance teams. And some of the key things you mentioned, which I love around like marketing, is like everyone's trying to figure out like what's the next marketing thing, and the best ideas are usually right in front of you. So if you ask people, and like you said, and it feels like an ask to you because you're asking to do stuff, but for them, it's like visibility again. I can be on the blog, and I remember like, when I was on inside sales coming up, I got a similar story to you. I had no degree. I became a Fortune 500 exec off of that. And when I used to get asked to do certain things, it might seem like an ask to them, but I was all game. I was like, yeah, I'll speak on stage. Yeah, I'll do it. And people are willing to do that if you give them that opportunity. So I think providing that space for the visibility is key. Maceo, I'm really enjoying the conversation and discussion, and I want to make sure that we still remain concise and people can go away with some gems. Are there any other things that you think are worth mentioning that we haven't discussed today when it comes to ERGs that are just really, really key for you to be able to drive a successful program?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and I don't even think I've said this on LinkedIn yet, but my biggest hack into a successful ERG program is treating it like a successful business. So I learned good business tactics more than anything. I learned marketing, and then marketing shows up within the ERG. How are you internally marketing your ERG? I learned sales tactics, and it's almost like with each event, we're selling people on participating. We're not selling it in a way so that they have to pay, but they have to pay in time. So you have to learn how to be a good salesman. These are, learning how to be a good business person will directly translate to leading a good ERG. Mission statements, same thing, shows up in business. All these things, data shows up in business. So if you want to improve your ERG or just an ERG program, or even if you're really just interested in doing more in this space, learning business is the key. It's so broad. There's so many ways to learn business, quote unquote, but information's out there.
Yeah, no, I get it. I think to your point, ensuring that you have the right structure, that's what we talked about, which is about business. You're not going to set up a business if you don't have any structure. No one knows what they're doing. You've got the right governance, as you mentioned, ensuring that you've got the right cadence as well. You understand how to spend budgets. It's all business related. And I think if you go into with that mindset, your results are going to be far greater than others. And look, I really appreciate your time, your energy and effort into this space, because too many times it's been given, as I mentioned, just to like a random person inside the organization who doesn't know what to do and they want to help, but they feel overwhelmed. So you're doing great work, Maceo. Please continue, as I'm sure you will. And we're here to support for you to grow and flourish. And thank you for being part of the ERG podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Definitely, I think that this is a great platform. So, yeah, happy to be here.
You're welcome.